This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. It's Stephen Bauman and Mathias.
We're back in action, dynamic duo.
And we're here to talk about a nation that's been in the news, that has been not only in the news recently, but in the news for a very long time, because it's an important country with huge geopolitical ramifications.
North Korea, do you say?
North Korea. And North Korea, it's a kind of funny. So like going back to college, I have a connection with South Korea, you know, and when I first heard that I was going to study in the Republic of Korea or South Korea, I would tell people, oh, I'm going to Korea. And people in Louisiana, where I went to college at LSU, thought it was funny to say, oh, what Korea? And like, this is, you know, 2009.
Gotcha. Were you a freshman, sophomore?
I was, so I was there my junior year.
Gotcha, okay.
But this is a sophomore preparing to go at one of the biggest, you know, flagship university of a state. And like, that was a real question from people who are presumably among the most educated in America, maybe even the world, was which Korea?
Well, I mean, yeah, well, we all know you can just waltz into North Korea, right? Like, open border situation, very welcoming to foreigners, no restrictions.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of shocking, though, right? Like, I guess...
well, I mean...
Is that unfair of me?
Maybe, I don't know, we're biased because we, like, professionally, right, supposedly study history, but... I don't know. I think most Americans don't know too much about Korea. Well, we often call the Korean War the Forgotten War.
The Forgotten War?
Most people don't because we think like, oh, World War II, Vietnam, and we've just sort of skip over a lot of the time that there was this huge, you know, war that killed tens of thousands of Americans and millions of Koreans, and that set up modern day North and South Korea, but we don't really have a good understanding of that conflict.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a really important episode, and I think people have a lot to learn here, and there's no shame in not knowing any history of North and South Korea, and I really wish in the past couple weeks the news had done a better job of going a little bit back in history and talking about the Korean War. You know, when Donald Trump made the comments about we're going to get, you know, people told me they wanted to get their sons back from the Korean War. I mean...
Which is just like, those people would be long dead.
Yeah, it's just...
Assuming that... Because the Korean War was, 1953?
1950 to 1953.
1953. So that's a 3-year war. Let's say you were born in, 1923. So you're like... Or no, you're born in, say,
23 and you serve in 50.
You serve in 50, you're 18, 19 years old or something, right?
Uh-huh. A little older.
Oh, a little older. Man, my own math. Say you're born in 1930. You're born at 19. So you're only a 20-year-old or younger when you serve in Vietnam. You probably would be dead by now.
That means your parents would have had to have been born in 1900.
Or 1910 or something crazy.
Either way, just that sort of thing almost went unchecked entirely. So let's get quickly to
so lay it out.
1950.
Lay it out for me, Steve.
Yeah.
What is up with Korea?
I mean, so we could go way back with Korea. You know, what I want to stress before to get to the Korean War is Korea's sort of importance as a state in between. So, it's a state in between two powers. Japan is very powerful for a long time, and China is very powerful for a long time. And that's certainly true in the 19th century. Korea is autonomous. It has its own emperor, but at the same time, it's sort of like a client state of China.
Yeah, that's my understanding, is that basically for almost all of its recorded history, it's always been in the shadow of China. It's always been a client state or a vassal, but it's always been, the little guy.
But in the Chinese vassal system, the Koreans could still speak Korean. There was Korean cultural and linguistic, autonomy. So Korea had some sort of freedom.
Is the language, is it similar to Chinese, or is it...
So the Korean language is not transparent, right? So Chinese and Korean do not understand each other. The Korean things like the Korean counting system is based on Chinese. So san in Chinese 1 2 3
Gotcha.
yeah, so on and so forth. There's also the Korean names have 2 writing systems, but the Koreans developed their own alphabet. So they don't use Chinese characters, especially not after the nationalist movement. So there's quite a difference of cultural separation.
But then we get to the 19th century.
Right, and they're opened up by the French and the Americans. Start going to Korea. A lot of missionaries move to Korea. Christianity becomes wildly popular in Korea in the late 1880s. The Presbyterians go to Korea and make a huge impact. And so Korea becomes sort of like an open trading nation.
But then along comes Japan.
Big, bad Imperial Japan, who just, tested their military on the Russian Empire.
So that was in 1904, was the Russo-Japanese War.
Right.
Because my understanding is that Japan basically invades the Korean Peninsula and kind of attempt to colonize it.
That's exactly correct. And Japan, is
and they do this like late 1890s, early 1900s.
Well, so they start sticking their toes in the water in the late 1800s, but it's not until after their success in the Russo-Japanese War where they get President Theodore Roosevelt to sort of say, "Wow, this Japanese nation is for real." That they officially colonized Korea. 1905 is when they officially annexed Korean peninsula, the entire peninsula.
And I assume most Koreans took this well. They were like, yes, great Japan, awesome, we love you.
The colonization,
us,
the forced abdication of the emperor, King Gojong.
Kind of like some racism, I assume, as well, right? Japanese claiming that they're superior to the Koreans.
Yeah, everything you would expect from an imperial colonization, but it's not until 1910 that the Japanese start really turning it up and banning Korean language. They ban Korean names. Japanese becomes the language taught in schools, and they really make it. And this is also done with sort of Theodore Roosevelt's blessing, where the United States says, "Okay, Japan, you can have Korea."
Because they're Western, they're hip, they're modern.
And we also the American perception is that the Japanese are white.
Yeah, they're like, you two are a master race. You are awesome. You are cool.
And the U.S. lets Japan have Korea, despite the agreements that the U.S. already has with Korea, in order so that the Japanese will not take the Philippines. So the Philippines, which the U.S. takes in the Spanish-American War,
is close to Japan, and they know Japan is expanding. So yeah, a little bit of horse trading. You get Korea, we get the Philippines, everyone's happy.
Precisely. So let's keep going.
But what about China? China's probably not happy.
Well, at this point, so China's going through its own independence movement, and China...
Mao's on the rise.
No, this is pre-Mao.
Oh, so this is still the Ming, the Qing are still in power.
Right. Well, they're falling apart, and the Chinese Republic is 1910 too. So Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai, and all that's happening down South China. So the capital in China, Nanjing, is the more important area. So China's, falling apart, and it has all the Western imperial roots, so that has its own history, but they don't have enough power to check the Japanese right now. And the Americans aren't going to check the Japanese, and the Russians tried and they lost.
Yeah.
So we get to 1919, Korea declares independence. So Korea has these educated nationalist leaders. World War I ends, and Wilson issues this doctrine of self-determination.
And the Koreans think, this is great, because now America has given us permission to declare independence from Japan.
And what's more is Professor Wilson at Princeton University mentored some of the Korean independence leaders.
The plot thickens.
So Lee Sung-man, Philip J. Sun, these guys studied at Princeton.
And those are the major.
These are some of the big independence movement, and these guys had been on the East Coast of the United States. They're heavily tied with the Presbyterian ministry, which we know Woodrow Wilson was, a fan of defending the Christian faith and things like that. So things looked good for Korea. They declared independence just down the street at Independence Hall in Philadelphia.
Really?
A huge celebration for Korean independence, a demonstration.
But I'm sure Japan took that well.
Yeah.
Japan was like, yes, we'll leave.
Yeah, so Japan basically just slaughtered the demonstrating Koreans, the ones who were in Korea, and Korea had to set up its government in exile in Shanghai.
Oh.
Yes.
So, and then my understanding is that's basically kind of the situation is Japanese continued sort of domination despite sort of this Korean government in exile and official declarations of Korean independence up until World War II.
Right. Yeah, the League of Nations decides that Korea is not actually a real country. They're not real people. Decide the
You're Japanese.
delegation that they send with historical, cultural, economic...
Korea is fake news.
Pretty much. The League of Nations does this. So it's always interesting, too, talking about like the failure of League of Nations. People usually like turn to Mussolini and the invasion of Ethiopia, but man, was it failing from day one.
Yeah. Well, it had no backbone.
And the Japanese were like, well, if you recognize Korea, we're out. And then who runs the League of Nations in Asia? Anyway, so that's
Sun Yat-sen, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, that's a different podcast episode. We can do the craziness of China.
Yeah, we need
up until World War II and the revolution.
And China's going to keep coming up.
Yeah.
Because it's...
So, well, all this, so basically going into like the 1920s, you have like a kind of a quasi-stable situation. Japan still claims dominance in Korea. It claims that Korea is now part of Japan. Japan is still ramping up for the creation of its expanded Eastern Asian empire, which it's dreaming of, and it's going to take over China, and it's going to take over Manchuria, and basically, in Indochina, basically the entirety of like East Asia, Southeast Asia is going to be part of this new...
Asia for the Asians.
Yeah, this part is going to be part of this new Japanese empire. And so the Japanese are kind of ramping up for that. And so this is going into the 1920s, the 1930s. At the same time, China's just going through a brutal civil war. It's kind of like a struggle. But, well, it's warlords. It's like the communists being led by Mao. And then it's also the Kuomintang, who are kind of like Chinese nationalist party who have kind of like quasi-socialistic-y policies, though. They're led by Sun Yat-sen, and then after he dies...
Chiang Kai-shek.
I know him as Chiang Kai-shek with like all the, translations. Is that the pinyin or whatever?
Well, the pinyin for Chiang Kai-shek is Jiang Jieshi.
Oh, man, yeah. So there's like there's all these systems of how you like translate Chinese names into English.
Same with Korean.
Yeah, and so there's kind of like this weird situation where the Koreans are like stuck. Like they're just like stuck under the Japanese. But there's also this like powerful nationalist movement that's largely active in exile in other countries,
as well as in Korea. Like if we go back to this is basic. It comes up every book and every talk. Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities. Communities are being created through Korean word. And one of the reasons that the Japanese banned the Korean language is because these newspapers are so successful. The Korean nationalist movements in Korea are rallying around the alphabet. It's so important in Korean language because the Japanese don't have it. The Japanese, have their own writing systems, hiragana, katakana, but the Koreans have an entirely Korean system.
Yeah, well, I assume that's also... because what differentiates, say, if you're a Korean person from a Japanese person? By and large, right? Like,
well, you cook your fish and you eat your vegetables raw.
Okay, so it's like culinary differences, but also majorly linguistic differences. Because by and large, everyone is practicing roughly similar religions.
And there's also the sort of like historical differences of things like within the 19th century where Koreans adopt Christianity more than almost any other Asian nation does, whereas Japan has its own form of Buddhism really take off.
Gotcha.
So Korea is a little different in that sense as well. Anyway, so throughout these resistance movements that continue to grow, nationalism in Korea just grows enormously.
So this is like a 2-decade period, basically, like from the 1920s up until the outbreak of World War II.
Right, and those that are staying in Korea remain intensely Korean. Those abroad continue to fuel the nationalistic flames. Some, like Kim Il-sung, who eventually becomes the leader of North Korea, they go north to the Japanese province of Manchuria, the puppet state of Manchuria.
Yeah, well, so let's kind of rewind. So we have like that weird kind of quasi-stable, sort of semi-stable situation of continued Japanese domination. There's like kind of civil war and chaos in mainland China. And then there's this area in northern China called Manchuria. It's like on the border of like China and kind of Mongolia and like the Eurasian steppe. So the Japanese, as part of their like planning for a giant East Asian empire, decide that the first step in that is they're going to move into Manchuria. And so I think it's 1937, the Japanese... Or 33.
Yes.
So 1933, the Japanese launch a full-scale invasion of this region of northern China called Manchuria, and they set up a puppet state, or kind of like this vassal state called Manchukuo, right?
Uh-huh.
And so this is then going to be their launching pad for when they do a broader invasion of southern mainland China in 1937. And so effectively for China, that's when World War II breaks out. And really, but it's also hard to even talk about World War II in Asia, because it's like there's basically just continuous conflict from like the early 30s, and then there's the Civil War in China. Basically, like that whole area of the world is at war in some form or another for like a 30-year period. It's very wild.
Yeah.
And so that's when, starting in like the 30s, that, as you were saying, Kim Il-sung and these other nationalists, the more rabid nationalists, move north into Manchukuo, because then they can actually like start carrying out military raids against the Japanese.
Yeah, and Manchukuo is like the second test for the League of Nations, where Japan, there's a railway incident and Japan says, we need to go in there to protect our companies that are there. And the League of Nations is like,
capitalism,
okay, go for it,
Japan.
Japan.
Imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. They use capitalism as an example. And this is where a lot of like, there's some really interesting cross-cultural stories, because a lot of Japanese go and immigrate and become farmers in Manchuria, and they're there for the next 20 years, you know. They place the leader as the last emperor of China. There's a movie called The Last Emperor.
Yeah.
Puyi is the last.
Directed by Martin Scorsese.
It's actually a fantastic
and
film.
it's an amazing movie. You should all watch it if you want to get like a... It's an amazing drama. Also teaches you a lot about Chinese history.
Fantastic, yeah, and that colonial period is just so interesting. And Kim Il-sung he's born in 1912. He goes to China younger, actually. He leaves Korea like around age 8. We don't really know everything, but he's educated in China. And this becomes an issue later on because, you know, Chinese is almost his first language.
But he's still a Korean nationalist, right? He still like identifies Korea as his homeland. He wants to fight for it, establish Korea.
Exactly.
And do we know when he becomes like a communist? Do we know when he gravitates towards that?
So, conspiracy theorists love Kim Il-sung.
Oh, yeah, because they'd be like, he's like a agent of China, or he's an agent of Stalin, or he's an agent of like
anything, or he's not real,
or he's an agent of like of American capitalists trying to like subvert like the socialist movement.
Well, we don't really know. So we actually we know where he went.
You mean North Korea isn't allowing people access to archives?
I know,
what?
Shocking. No, but we know where he went to middle school, which is actually the city that I taught in China.
Yeah, so we should rewind back. Steve is a world traveler, so you were not just in Korea for a little bit in Seoul, right?
Yeah.
You were also spent a little bit of time in Manchuria in China.
Right, and so the middle school where he went is still sort of like there's like a statue of him there, and like there's a Catholic church that he used to visit. In fact, one of the only countries that he would travel to is China, just so he could visit his old hometown. But and this was also like a big growth in anti-Japanese Chinese nationalism, anti-Japanese Korean nationalism,
and they kind of bond over this.
Total bond, and it's pushed back. But Kim Il-sung, his birth name is not Il-sung. Kim is the family name, and he adopts this name in the middle of a struggle. There's some tales that say he's a great commander. There's some that said that he was simply chosen by the Russians, and he adopted the actual Kim Il-sung's.
So what does Il-sung mean in Korean?
It's like the sun arrives or something.
Oh, like almost like a title.
It's
like,
a title, yeah. Or yeah, it's like a prophecy, really.
Like Kim, the dawning of the new...
and Kim is like just one of the three most important names.
So this is all happening in the 30s, right?
Yes.
Kim Il-sung, he's in Manchuria, which is now part of this like, you know, puppet state of China, Manchukuo. He's engaged, you know, he's getting part of the nationalist struggle. He's forming bonds and friendships and kind of ties with anti-Japanese Chinese nationalists who also tend to also sometimes be Chinese like communists.
Right.
And so what happens in like the late 30s after Japan starts its full-scale invasion of China and the rest of Asia? What does he do then?
Well, I think it's important. We can look at two clear like paths that lead to conflict. So you have the Korean government in exile in Shanghai, and Shanghai is one of the last places to fall because that's where the Westerners are in China. Yeah. So Japan doesn't take Shanghai until relatively late in the 1930s, or even later. I'm not even sure.
Early 40s.
Right. So Shanghai, and that's where the Koreans are. So that's where this like nationalist, not communist government, not rebellion, you know, so it's sort of like this similar story we see in Eastern Europe where there's the partisans and the nationalists.
Yeah, there's like, it's not just a two-way war, it's like a six-way war.
And the only thing they get along with is nationalism. So the key in Kim Il-sung's pushback is not the communism, it's nationalism.
Yeah, and so my understanding is he eventually makes his way back into Korea, into the northern part of Korea, and he starts basically a partisan guerrilla warfare campaign against the Japanese.
Yeah, so, and that's what they say. I mean, even that we don't know.
But that's like the mythology and kind of the narrative, right? Is that as Japan ramps up its war, Kim Il-sung, who knows who's funding him, who knows if he,
Right.
A lot of unknowns, but he makes his way from Manchuria back into the Korean Peninsula. He's mostly located in the north. He starts a following. He becomes kind of the leader of this partisan guerrilla warfare movement.
Right.
And he's really successful, is my understanding.
That's the narrative.
Well, this is the narrative, right? Like, yeah. Until, like, North Korea no longer exists and you can get access to the archives in Pyongyang. If they haven't burned them all, like, decades ago. And then my understanding, according to the narrative, is... My understanding is that yet another kind of conspiracy thing is that Americans and the British give him, like, weapons and money and support, right? Kind of like in Vietnam, like Indochina with Ho Chi Minh.
Sounds exactly like what we would do.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we do. So my understanding is that he's there. He's building this guerrilla warfare campaign. The narrative, of course, is he's like a genius and he's amazing by the North Koreans. But anyway, so after the war ends, Japan withdraws from the Korean Peninsula, and the idea is that Kim Il-sung, is in the north with his like glorious partisan army, which is also a kind of communistic-y movement. It's got support from China. It's got some support from the Soviet Union. However, the Americans and other sort of European powers do not necessarily want to support Kim Il-sung and his movement as the new sort of face of an independent Korean nation.
Right, after the Japanese are defeated, and the country is split in part on the 38th parallel. We talked about that a little last week.
So when does it split? When does that officially happen?
In 1945. In 1945, the United States, shortly after the atomic bombs are dropped, the United States knows that the Russians are coming.
Well, yeah, because my understanding is that they're like, oh crap, we have like a communist insurgency movement in the north. This is going to allow basically the Soviets access into the northern part of Korea, and then from there they'll just take over the rest of the peninsula.
Right, and so this is one case where the United Nations could have worked. So in the U.S. splits the Korean Peninsula, and the official UN platform is that Korea is going to have peninsula-wide democratic elections after there's stability. So in 3 years or whatever, after the post-war immediate chaos is over, all Koreans will be able to vote. They'll get to decide if they want Kim Il-sung, if they want Lee Sung-man.
Yeah, and so Lee Sung-man, he's also another Korean nationalist. So, right, because my understanding is after the war, all of these Korean nationalists who were in exile come back. And some of them support Kim Il-sung and some don't, right?
Right, and there's also...
Because this is not just a conflict between, like... Geopolitically, it's a conflict within, like, Korean nationalists themselves of how they want the country to go.
Exactly, and right away, though, people kind of see through it because Kim Il-sung's backed by the Soviets, and they know that the Soviets support him, and, like, the Communist Party's established in 1945, and there's a big population demographic shift because... most of the Christian Koreans are actually in North Korea at the time, and they see communism coming and it kind of scares them. So a lot of people are moving. It's just chaos. There's people coming back. There's a lot of Japanese who had lived there for 40 years who are now leaving.
Yeah, because they were part of this colonizing movement.
There's the whole issue of comfort women who had been, used by the Japanese army for war
as sex slaves,
are displaced. Yeah. They're coming back from Japan, some of them. So, like, it's just absolute chaos. And of course, I mean, it was idealistic of the UN to think we're going to have free elections by 1948 or whatever. They don't end up doing it. In 1948, North Korea is created as a country. The Soviets...
With Soviet and Chinese backing. Because in 1949... is when the Chinese Civil War officially ends with a victory by Mao and the communists.
Right. And almost immediately after that, South Korea declares its independence as the Republic of Korea. So you have the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and you have the Republic of Korea in South Korea. in 1948 and fall. Both of them declare independence. North Korea, though, and the Soviets sign off on this, claim the entire peninsula.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because this is like sets up kind of the big Cold War dynamic where South Korea, right? Because the usual line with the history of the Cold War is that the Americans are operating under the policy of containment, right? This idea that if we don't actively push back against the spread of communism, if we don't, literally contain it like a quarantine, it's going to spread like wildfire and destroy the world and destroy us. So we have to aggressively block the spread or the movement of communist parties and communist nations. And so the idea is, my God, we have to partition Korea and we have to support a government in the South to prevent the spread of communism through the whole peninsula. On the flip side, the Soviets and the Chinese also have this fear of what they call capitalist encirclement. This is something Stalin talked about a lot, is that we've established, socialism and in one country and we're trying to spread it for the global revolution, but the capitalists are trying to box us in. They're trying to like basically strangle us like in the cradle. They're encircling us, taking us over. And so we need to sort of break out of this encirclement. And it seemed that Korea is a good place to do that because the fear is after the war, they're like, okay, Japan is now basically going to be controlled by the Americans. And then all the Americans have to do to get to China, which is now a communist state, is they just have to hop over to South Korea and then hop from South Korea to mainland China. Because Korea functions as a nice, midway point. And so there's a lot of fear that Korea South Korea under American, backing and kind of allyship, is functioning as like a good sort of gateway for an American push into China.
Yeah.
And even into the Soviet Union, because Russia or the Soviet Union borders. I mean, Russia today still borders a tiny little border, but it borders North Korea. And so at the time, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union also had a border. And the worry is like, well, that's not North Korea is not a big place. Yeah. It's not that far from the border between South Korea and North Korea and then the border with the Soviet Union.
But at the same time, the Soviets are wise to the fatigue that the Americans and their own nation feel.
Yeah, no one wants war.
The Chinese, they, number one, don't want war. And when North Korea is proclaimed a republic in 1948, the Soviets withdraw. They leave. And so there's sort of this like feeling that North Korea is gonna be on its own for a little bit, and hopefully it doesn't get invaded.
And it has more primary, after the Soviets leave, has more primary backing from China.
Right, but even China also, just having completed the war, is trying to get on its own feet and establish. It's more concerned about Taiwan and are the Kuomintang going to invade again from the south? And so China even is like just struggling to survive. But Kim Il-sung wants immediately to reunify Korea. Well, because the Soviets signed off on a document that says you own Korea. Sounds good to me. So, and this is like another really interesting sort of Cold War history where Kim Il-sung doesn't really get the support of the Soviets. He lies to the Chinese and says that he has the support of the Soviets, and the Chinese reluctantly sort of say, well, if they're in it, I guess we have to be. He invades South Korea, the United Nations.
In 1950.
1950.
Yeah, so this is also an important point for kind of propaganda reasons, because to this day, North Korea claims that the Korean War was started by South Korea and the evil Americans. They claim it was South Korea that attacked them and that they were always waging a defensive war against American imperialism. Whereas the historical record very clearly shows that it was the North Koreans that attacked first.
Unless you believe their Declaration of Independence, in which case South Korea would be an illegal occupying force.
Yeah, tomato. But at the same time, there's also an American general in South Korea who has a little bit of animosity towards communism, right?
A little bit. I mean, after he's done setting up New Japan.
Yeah, and this is
MacArthur.
MacArthur, yeah. And so MacArthur, he was in the Philippines, right?
Well, he owned that whole Asian.
Yeah. So MacArthur was one of the great American generals of World War II. What's his full name? I always forget his full name. Just MacArthur, yeah. I mean, it's like Bono. He's like a one name guy.
Yeah.
He reached that stat. So he was one of the biggest American generals in World War II. He was focused on the Eastern sort of ocean campaign against Japan. I think he had a lot of activity in the Philippines. But the thing is, he, through that campaign, kind of he achieved almost this like almost demigod kind of status within like the American public because he was just absolutely victorious. He's a war hero, and he kind of lets it go to his head, I think.
Yeah.
He kind of like starts to see himself as like, I am like this new like god general, like I am I'm protecting America and civilization.
He forced the Japanese emperor, who had hitherto been a god, to sign a new constitution in which he was going to have the power.
Yeah, so MacArthur has a massive ego coming out of the end of the war, and then he's in charge of the occupation and rebuilding of Japan. And one of the big things that's on his radar is the situation in Korea.
And China. And on top of this, the United Nations gets to test itself out. And because the permanent members of the Security Council at the United Nations, Soviet Union's not showing up. So then it's just France, United Kingdom, the USA, and China, who's still represented by Taiwan, the Republic of China.
Yeah.
So they vote. And the United Nations actually says that this was an act of aggression and they need defense. So led by the U.S.
So this is the North Korean attack. Isn't it? And so then MacArthur comes to lead American and South Korean sort of forces.
And North Korea had already conquered Seoul. North Korea was basically stopped at the southern city of Busan.
So basically they already had almost total control of the peninsula.
Almost total control. And the Soviets told Kim Il-sung, you need to watch, or no. The Chinese told him, Incheon, it's the port that the United States is going to have an amphibious landing and destroy you. They told him, and there's documents
and they ignored it.
They ignored it.
Kim Il-sung ignored it, and guess what? That's what MacArthur did.
The famous Incheon.
And so MacArthur, and this is like starting in 1950, 51, leads an incredibly successful campaign and push northward.
He goes to the border, the Yalu River.
Yeah, he goes to the
Yalu River.
Yeah, and that's what's the parallel? I always forget the exact.
Oh no, but the border with China.
Oh, the border with China, but isn't like if I'm understanding my history correctly, I'm not like a North Korean expert by any means, but my understanding is that China kind of says, hey, if you go past the river, we will consider that an act of aggression against us, China, and we will fight back and push you back.
Well, China's horrified because MacArthur...
Well, because but again, like, it's geopolitical. They're worried this could be a full-scale invasion because MacArthur is like a nutball. Like, he has this massive ego and he thinks he's like the second coming of Jesus. And he's like, let's invade China and take it over.
Absolutely. And MacArthur said, look what we just did to Japan. Let's drop a nuke on Beijing.
Yeah, he's like, because you know how like after World War II in Europe, Patton was the type of guy where he was like, yeah, and let's like start a war with the Soviets. Let's crush the communists now. Yeah. We did it to the Nazis. And MacArthur's that same guy in Asia where he's like, let's just do it. Let's just go and fight a war again now and crush them once and for all.
But what happens is MacArthur gets replaced. And
because MacArthur also doesn't like Truman.
Yeah.
And this is like an infamous like battle of wills between Harry Truman and MacArthur. Like they hate each other, like just the worst possible clashing of wills. And so finally Truman he like takes him out of the conflict because Truman's like,
a lot of people are going to die.
I'm sitting you down, buddy. Yeah. And within like conservative circles, MacArthur becomes almost this like martyr figure because it's like if only we had just let him do. If only we had just let MacArthur do what he wanted to do, we wouldn't have to worry about like China or communism ever again.
Ended communism.
The
Chinese, the People's Volunteer Army streams across the Yalu River with millions.
So he never actually crossed.
He never does.
Okay, but China, in response to what it perceived to be like an imminent invasion,
life or death,
just went all out.
And they think, well, it's better we set fire to North Korea than China.
Yeah, and so my understanding is it gets really brutal. This is like, what, 52?
50, well, yeah. No, this is as early as 51.
Oh, okay.
And then they fight back to the stalemate.
Yeah, to the stalemate, where they basically push American and South Korean forces all the way back to the 30th parallel, because China sort of says, we're not going to allow you to present a threat to us anymore. Right. And my understanding is that, like, millions of Chinese troops get killed, or quite a few.
So the
it's hard to tell.
total toll for the Korean War I read was 2.5 million.
That's official.
And
that's like 2.5 million of
combatants
on all sides.
I think so.
Because I've heard accounts of like upward of like 4 million Koreans. get killed.
We'd never know.
Yeah, we have no idea. But suffice it to say is that lots of people get killed. Lots of Koreans get killed.
Lots of Chinese
get killed.
Lots of Americans.
How many feel like 50,000? Something like that?
Maybe.
Like a fair amount, which is mind-boggling that we don't really talk about the Korean War, because it's a fairly large amount of American troops die or are wounded.
And when we talk about it, the narrative is just quizzical sometimes, like one of our greatest victories, things like this.
But it's sort of like an apparent, loss for America, because the Chinese demonstrably force America to retreat back into past the parallel to South Korea.
Right.
And then my understanding is that after that sets up the dynamic we have to this day of North and South Korea, where China gives nominal material political backing to North Korea. North Korea consolidates into a one-party totalitarian dictatorship. The United States puts a lot of backing into the South Korea and promotes it as this kind of bastion of democracy and blah, blah, blah. But the war never is officially ended because no treaty is ever technically signed. My understanding is there's only ever a ceasefire. Armistice. So basically a ceasefire that has lasted for almost 7 decades.
Well, even the armistice has been rolled back.
Oh.
But the China is mad at North Korea.
Because they see that North Korea was why did you do that? Because it's kind of like that thing like your homie, it's like when you're at a bar and your buddy. Your buddy gets in is getting really mouthy with somebody and is picking a fight and be I'm gonna mess this guy up, and you're dude, don't do it. And then your buddy who's kind of short and scrappy gets in a fight and totally gets his butt kicked, and so then you have to jump into the fight to help him so he doesn't get killed.
Yeah.
And then you beat the other guy back, and then it's kind of a stalemate, and you're why did you start that fight, man?
Exactly. Not to mention there's a death in the Soviet Union.
Stalin, yeah. And so this is again, so Soviet troops were never actually involved in the Korean War, but Stalin and the Soviets did provide some material aid, like guns and supplies and money and the rest of it. But Soviet troops were never actually committed because Stalin also was terrified that if Soviet troops get involved, that's going to start World War III. And this is also when both superpowers have now developed nuclear weapons or close to it. I think the Soviets, when did they get nukes? In the early 50s?
They had the potential, yeah.
Yeah, and so Stalin is also very leery of the situation because they're also scared because, as we said earlier, the Soviet Union does share a border with North Korea. So it's if the Americans do this, they will basically be setting up their own client state that borders the Soviet Union, and that's a threat. And so everybody's really terrified that the Korean War is going to break out into World War III.
And then, not to mention, with Stalin's death, the Soviet Union starts going a different direction.
Yeah.
You have the Sino-Soviet split.
Yeah. So that's another thing where the Soviet, under Khrushchev and Mao really come to major disagreements with each other in the late 50s because Mao thinks that the Soviets are getting soft and aren't really aggressively continuing the world revolution. And the Soviets think Mao is going insane and is going to start World War III.
Yeah.
And so they're actually there's accounts of at one point people were really terrified that China and the Soviet Union would go to war. Hundreds of thousands of troops were massed on the Chinese-Soviet border at one point.
Yeah.
I think late 50s, early 60s.
And this is when China goes back to North Korea. So China was sort of screw you, North Korea.
So China doubles down on North Korea.
In the 50s, China and North Korea are not talking. And I mean, they're talking, but
in the 60s.
It's 1961 that China and North Korea sign an agreement where China says, okay, North Korea, if the South invades, we'll help you again.
Yeah, and that also adds up the stakes because for this whole time, there's just basically been, the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Everyone's kind of looking at each other through the barrel of a gun and what's going to happen. And then this raises the stakes of the Korean stalemate because it's America realizes if we ever try to mess with North Korea again, China will be very active again, not just if we go to the border of China in North Korea, but if we cross the DMZ itself. And so that also raises the stakes of the conundrum.
Yeah, and there's also the issue of internationalism. So whereas the Chinese communism is sort of a little more internationalist, at least in the 1960s, Korean nationalism or Korean communism is super nationalistic. And so Kim Il-sung starts this thinking we're not like the Soviet Union, we're not like China.
We don't want to spread, we want to consolidate within North Korea.
And in the 70s, he starts hanging with people like Nicolae Ceausescu from Romania and Enver Hoxha.
And those are all extraordinarily isolated, reactionary, they're hyper-Stalinist regimes because after Stalin dies, of course, there's in the Soviet Union a de-Stalinization campaign. Khrushchev basically says we're not going to keep doing the same incredibly oppressive policies that Stalin did. But like North Korea and these other like tiny little communist countries like Albania and Romania don't ever have a de-Stalinization period. So they still keep the classics of communism under Stalin of like, oh, you know, the gulag or like forced labor camps. We're still gonna like do massive repression. We're still gonna like have massive censorship. We're still basically gonna like create all these collective farms that aren't very economically efficient. So lots of people are starving to death. You know, we're gonna like basically close ourselves off from the rest of the world. We're not gonna trade. It's really bad. So
even in the Cultural Revolution in China, so when Mao's Red Guards are going around and like Kim Il-sung replicates a lot of this stuff later, but at the time the Red Guard in China is denouncing Kim Il-sung as a traitor to communism. So like it's wild. Like we sort of think of these countries as being similar, but they're so wildly different, especially in the 60s and the 70s, and the rift begins to grow between North Korea. So North Korea and South Korea are pretty much equal economically and militarily in the 50s.
Well, yeah, because they both are recovering from like a long period of war.
In the 60s, North Korea's initial like sort of command economy is kind of working, and they have some Soviet...
they're getting a lot of material aid from the Soviets.
So the 60s are not bad for the North Koreans. In the 70s, it's a little tougher, and that's when South Korea really starts to grow. South Korea's been sending people in the 70s and the 80s to Germany, to the Middle East, to work on construction projects.
Yeah, my understanding then is that kicks off the sort of the South Korean technological boom, which now has basically made South Korea almost like a sci-fi country. Like in my mind, when I read about like how the whole country is like Wi-Fi access everywhere for free and hyper quick public transport.
Right, so there's a huge divergence that begins to happen, and North Korea continues to grow farther and farther away from sort of like the norms of diplomacy. They blow up a Korean Airlines flight in 1987, right before the Olympic Games are held in Seoul.
While all this is going on, Kim Il-sung and the Kim family is doubling down on creating this cult of personality.
Right.
And that, which I think today is now kind of a hallmark within American minds of North Korea, is that they really start buckling down on creating this like mythology, this almost kind of like creating them out to be like these like more than human, almost godlike figures. Because they're also continuing kind of the Stalin style cult of personality. And so Kim Il-sung, right, of course, becomes this like
eternal president.
Eternal president, you know, born of like a god or something, you know, like the smartest, the greatest, the best person ever. And then when does he die? I think in the 80s?
No. He dies in 1993.
Oh, so he lives for a long time.
He retains power longer than any other leader that is not a monarch in the 20th century.
Because he's in charge of North Korea from what, 53 to... That's almost...
No, 48 until 48. 94.
So that's a good chunk of time.
Yes.
That's like 40...
It's over 40 years.
Yeah.
In fact, the only person who passes him is Fidel Castro, who lives until 2011.
Which is pretty wild.
But Castro, spans 2 centuries then. Yeah. So he's not only in the 20th century. So Kim Il-sung is the longest in the 20th century.
So things are getting like increasingly, you know, that kind of stalemate of isolation. The DMZ, South Korea is blowing up into a huge economic superpower. And China, getting more complicated, has opened itself up to the West and to the rest of the world for like, you know, economic reasons starting in the 70s and 80s. So China is on this big boom coming into the 80s.
And China offers North Korea an out. In like the late 80s, Deng Xiaoping in the early 90s, he goes to North Korea and he like shows what China's about to do. And it's a gamble, and the Cold War is ending. So I titled this episode "Price of Peace." You know, like what is the price of peace? And the number one thing is always security in North Korea's mind for this whole time. And they see the Soviet Union's collapsing. China is changing their system. So anytime you have change, a regime is going to fall. So North Korea sees Deng Xiaoping and thinks, this guy's an idiot.
Yeah, well, I think they think that what's going to happen to like the Soviet Union is what's going to happen to China. Yeah. When exactly the opposite happens, right? And so, so North Korea doesn't take the out. It doubles down on its isolationism.
For security.
And that's also right when North Korea really starts to put out its feelers into developing nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
Because North Korea it's like this like kind of the prisoner's dilemma like strategy, because they don't want to modernize, or at least the leadership doesn't want to modernize and open themselves up because they're terrified that will mean the end of them and the end of the country. They at the same time know that if they don't get some sort of powerful weapons and open up on their military, they'll be weak and then easily invaded, because they're also terrified because there's still like an active military standoff situation at the border. So then North Korea starts to invest in trying to develop nuclear weapons because they see that as the ultimate deterrent to any kind of, funny business by South Korea or by America.
Exactly. And so North Korea is struggling here to survive, and it is listed as a terrorist nation by the United States after it bombs the airliner. That designation as a terrorist country doesn't help it.
Well, because it's all under like all kinds of sanctions still.
Totally,
right?
yeah.
And like all kinds of travel restrictions. Well, I mean, North Koreans can't really leave anyways. But it's like not many people can get in.
Yeah,
stuff like that.
It's almost entirely cut off from the world. And then when the Soviet Union collapses, Russia revokes everything it promised.
Yeah, and so this is a big deal for North Korea because it loses a ton of material aid.
And it's already sort of pissed off China again.
Yeah, and so what happens going into the 90s is that, North Korea had always been in bad shape economically, bluntly, and it had been kind of miserable for the people. Lots of people were dying or living bad lives, but it was still like terrible, but it wasn't as bad as it was like the utter hellscape it was going to become in the 90s, because then after Russia revokes material aid that the Soviet Union had been giving, and China kind of starts to cut ties a little bit because it sees North Korea as a liability increasingly.
Yeah.
So North Korea all of a sudden has no like economic backing anymore. And so they don't have a good productive capacity internally. And so in the 90s, this massive famine breaks out in North Korea.
Yeah.
And we don't know, but most experts, I think, claim that like a few million people die.
Right.
We don't know because, of course, North Korea denies that ever happened.
But we're talking 3 years of a famine in a country with 40 million people.
And this is like the mid-90s.
This is 95 to 98.
Yeah, and so this is a really, really bad famine. Lots of people die. And at this time, also, Kim Il-sung has died, and his son, Kim Jong-il, has come to power.
Right. And, so you can look at this, the most similar nation, I have to bring them into the conversation, is Cuba. And Cuba goes through this special period and enacts reforms that help it to survive. Cuba also doesn't develop nuclear weapons. During the 90s, North Korea is working very hard.
Yeah, and so any extra money that North Korea does have during this period, it's not putting towards getting food and supplies for the people, it's putting into its military and its weapons
because
program.
Number one is security. That's the concern. And so no one ensures their security. China doesn't do it. Lots of people die. And this becomes the story throughout Kim Jong-il's reign. This is like the saber rattling, then the concessions, then they survive a little bit longer.
And then, the economy somewhat stabilizes after the famine. Life is still pretty miserable in North Korea, right? It's still terrible. People probably are still, being worked to death or being tortured and starving. But famine has not yet returned, as far as I'm aware.
No.
North Korea.
And in 2000, there's an attempt at détente between South Korea and North Korea. Kim Dae-jung meets Kim Jong-il.
So don't be fooled necessarily by that the Trump talks might lead anywhere, because there have been lots of other talks.
Right. There have. And that's the sort of like... things had not worked. So the United States, fought in the Korean War. North Korea survived that. Sanctions had happened. They had been
for decades
put on this international list, and a lot of people died. The Soviet Union collapsed. North Korea survived. So, in the 2000s, people are starting to say, okay, we have to do something different.
Yeah, and I think the big fear going into the 2000s is the fear that North Korea might do something reckless, because China, right, for a long time sort of assured some sort of stability with its backing, and so did the Soviet Union, because America was like, well, we're never going to mess with North Korea because that could trigger a major war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, though, right, China is starting to seeing, North Korea as like an albatross around its neck. It's weighing its down, right?
Yeah.
Because China wants to modernize. China wants to become the new global superpower. It wants to also kind of put a better face to the world to make it attractive to outside investment and to travel. And it's hard to do that when you are backing a nasty totalitarian dictatorship. And so China starts to cut ties. It hasn't totally cut ties, but China has like every year is getting weaker and weaker and weaker ties with North Korea. And the Soviet Union is gone. Russia isn't really backing it. And so the fear, my understanding, is that everyone, like strategists worry going into the 2000s that North Korea, seeing that it has no major backing, might perceive some sort of threat that isn't really there and sort of lash out in kind of this uncertainty and potentially like blow up the peninsula.
Right, and basically hell breaks loose after the 2000s. So these talks, this promise breaks down. In 2002, George W. Bush names them part of the axis of evil.
Axis of evil.
So even more pressure is being put on.
Which doesn't do much to help the relationship, because what do we do to one of the members of the axis of evil? We invade them.
Yeah, I know. We cut them off from everything.
Well, because who was it? It was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
Yes.
And so it's like, well, we continue really nasty sanctions against Iran and we invade Iraq. And so the message, obviously, to the North Koreans would be like, are we going to be invaded next?
Precisely.
And so this is something, right, that I think that really actually drives the North Koreans into this like new kind of revanchism and doubling down on their nuclear weapons program, because they're like, well, then the only thing we have that will guarantee us not being invaded by the Americans is our nuclear capacity.
Exactly. And so another couple million people die from various famines, floods throughout the 2000s. North Korea is like essentially a failed state. You know, the UN food program is in there giving tons of food, basically propping up survival for people who are still there. It's enormously...
Everyone's basically malnourished.
Yeah. Right. They're just producing weapons to make sure it doesn't happen. And that becomes a key concern for talks going into the present day. North Korea, in every talk, in every case, says, how can you promise us we're not going to become like Iraq?
And not just that, but after Libya too. Because in Libya, right, so there's Muammar Gaddafi. He's kind of like a similar character of like, he runs this like hyper-nationalist kind of dictatorship. He like causes lots of conflict with Europe and America. You know, he blows up an airline or two.
Yeah.
But then there's like the Arab Spring, and then America supports these like kind of, you know, movements that really quickly blow up into this full level like insurgency, and then they end up killing Gaddafi and wiping out, you know, the regime. And that's also something I think that
horrifying.
Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, Gaddafi deserved it, right?
No, horrifying to the North
Koreans. Yeah. I mean, Libya is also messed up. I mean, so lots of people critique American backing because now they're like, well, now Libya is like a failed state and there's no... Anyways, different topic, different, you know, can of worms. But North Korea, the lesson the North Korean leadership gets out of the Libyan thing is like, crap. This is like extra... Well, it's like extra kind of like proof in their eyes that they have to have nuclear weapons.
Right.
And they have to have strong military power, because if they let up an inch, they allow themselves, they open up, you know, space for America to subvert and destroy them.
Right.
But the problem is, I kind of think that leads into the situation, because when did
in 2011
Kim Jong-un, when did he come into...
In 2011, Kim Jong-il does. And it should be noted about Kim Jong-un, he's in his 30s. Kim Il-sung was also in his 30s. Yeah. So, like... Kim Il-sung was in his... Kim Jong-il was much older when he took power. But, so a super young son of Kim Jong-il comes to power.
Kim Jong-un.
And he's faced with just a plate load of troubles. He's a young guy who wants to survive.
But he's also interesting, right? Because he's totally been raised in this, like, bubble land.
Yeah.
Because so that's also something that's kind of an X factor, is, like, what's going on through this guy's head? Because he's lived in this, like, leadership where he's been totally isolated for his entire life. And before that, and basically is like worshipped as like a god.
Right.
And so no one knows, like, does like a person who has been raised in that kind of world and receives nothing but praise all the time, how do they perceive strategy? Like, you know, how do they understand the world?
I'll tell you what the strategy is. In the North Korean constitution, it says that the Baekdu lineage, so this lineage that descends from this holy mountain in...
Oh yeah, because that's like, isn't that like the Korean mythology? They're like children of this mountain in the north.
So the Kims are the representatives of the lineage, and according to the constitution...
They are gods on earth.
They're going to continue the revolution. So he has to somehow live into that, or change the constitution, which is not going to happen.
And so my understanding is that with Kim Jong-un coming to power, things have gotten a bit... North Korea's gotten a bit more active again, right? In terms of didn't they kill like one of his brothers?
Yeah,
Or one of the,
Kim Jong-nam.
Yeah, who had, like, left, who had, like, fled and was, like, living in, like, South Korea or the Philippines.
He was in Japan, yeah.
He got killed by some North Korean agent who got poisoned him
Part
at
of
an airport.
the, like, Confucian ruling ideology says you keep your children from each consort in a different place so there's no power struggle.
Yeah.
So this is sort of like what Kim Jong-il did, because he had kids with all these women and he put them in different parts. And Kim Jong-un got sent to Switzerland and gets his education there. And Kim Jong-nam stays.
Oh, I forgot that Kim Jong-un had been educated in Switzerland.
And Kim Jong-nam stays, and he's famously caught in Tokyo Disneyland on a drunken weekend. He leaves North Korea, goes to Tokyo Disney while North Korea is just in the middle of famines and stuff. And this guy, obese Kim, is...
Yeah, like I think it should be noted that there's also something perverse about how Kim Jong-un is a large man and like... And
he's the only one in North Korea.
Yeah, everyone else is like rail thin because everyone's starving.
Yeah. Anyway,
but then also, right, Kim Jong-un, as my understanding, has really been ratcheting up the North Korean nuclear program.
Absolutely, and he's been solidifying power. So.
Yeah, he's been wiping out, like, members of his family and generals, other power centers. And so I guess that leads into the situation we have today.
Yeah.
But my understanding, too, is with North Korea that it's like a problem for everybody now. But nobody has a strong incentive to try and fix it because it would require everybody sacrificing something. Right? Like, China just doesn't want to deal with it anymore because it's such a problem for them now. At the same time, they get certain things out of North Korea. It's a nice way to kind of mess with the Americans for, I think, China. Like, I think, let's not, like, downplay that China is in a competition with America for global superpower status. And so any kind of, like, edge you can get on America is good. And so I think some of the Chinese leadership see the continued existence of North Korea with minimal Chinese backing as a nice kind of bargaining chip to be like, well, we can use North Korea as like a thing we can in talks with America. Also, as a result of the one-child policy, right, in Chinese culture, there's a clear preference for male sons and not female daughter. Sorry, obviously, there's a clear preference for sons and not daughters because of, like, long-standing cultural norms and marriage norms. The problem is, so lots of Chinese couples, they can only have one kid. They find out they're going to have a daughter, so they like abort the daughter or like infanticide or whatever. So this has led to like a massive gender imbalance in like the current generation in China, where there's like tens of millions of more men than there are women.
Yeah.
So in response, there's like going to be like a whole generation of like Chinese men that like never get married or maybe even have sex. So the question is like, some of these men, it's like, well, where are we going to get wives? Where are we going to find women? They get it from North Korea.
Yeah.
There's like a big kind of underground business of like Chinese men basically buying wives from North Korea.
That's one example among many activities of this sort of...
And also my understanding is that China also uses like cheap North Korean labor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like they like basically kind of like have this like buddy-buddy deal where they're like, hey, just like ship some North Koreans up into like Manchuria and we'll use them.
And like, so when this summit happened in Singapore, the Trump-Kim summit, and like... Kim Jong-un arrived on a China Airlines 747, and
he didn't have his own
Air China,
his own airline.
This
because
is what the news like said. Oh, look, he doesn't have his own. What a shame. But I'm thinking this is what a victory for China. It shows that China's still sort of in the background.
Yeah. I think that's a big. So I feel like the whole thing with North Korea is less about North Korea than it is about China and America. It's sort of like, how are we going to deal? Like, I think it's like this discussion over North Korea is more of a proxy for a broader, like, question of who has power in Asia.
Yeah.
So, accompanying kind of these problems, but also benefits for everybody, is like South Korea obviously has an incentive to like decrease tension because if a war breaks out, like North Korea itself doesn't actually present a real military threat to the U.S. Like, it doesn't have the capacity to like have an ICBM that could hit the American coast. Right, and America could easily just pull all troops out like tomorrow, and it would be an issue. But North Korea does have enough of a capacity to like blow up the whole peninsula, like wipe everybody out. And so obviously South Koreans are like, please, we don't want to be killed by by the North Korean regime. Let's do something to release tensions. And that was honestly, I think, how the current president came into power, right? Because like the South Korean president before him was super corrupt. There was like a massive protest movement that kicked him out, that kicked her out.
Yeah.
And then this guy, what's his name?
Moon Jae-in.
Moon Jae-in got elected under this like pretty radical kind of like peace deal like platform of saying, I will do my best to create peace or to reduce tensions with North Korea and even do some sort of unification so we're not all going to die one day.
Right. Yeah. Maybe not unification.
But also the problem is, like, even if, say, you, like, unify the Koreas, what's going to happen to North Korea? Like, because it's, like, a totally economic, like, you know,
well,
it's totally undeveloped. How are you going to integrate the North Korean people into any kind of, like, modern society? You know, what's going to happen to them?
Well, there's a lot of plans have been drawn out and stuff like these, like, you know, potentially having a separate democratic North Korean state. So, like, a Republic of North Korea, where they could, you know, spend 30 years as a different country that's kind of the same country as...
And play catch-up?
Yeah, because it's like, we're talking East-West Germany split. I mean, we're still seeing the ramifications of that today.
And this split is way more intense.
Times a million. Yeah. So, like, I mean, there's a million plans about that sort of thing, but the fact is the South Koreans it's in their interest to work for peace. South Korea and China normalized relations in the 1990s. So South Korea and China are friends too, which makes North Korea even more of a pariah because North Korea refuses to sort of like...
Yeah.
So seeing Kim Jong-un reach out to South Korea and actually show that he's like actually willing to leave his country and go to a place like Singapore, I mean, it's big news. It's a huge step in the history of North Korea. No North Korean president has felt that kind of security.
Yeah, and I think kind of in that too, Japan also has obviously a big incentive to try and create some sort of peace situation or reduce tension because Japan is just close enough to North Korea that North Korea could cause serious damage if they launch a nuclear weapon at Japan.
Not to mention, I'm not sure Japan would mind...
the fallout from Japan.
I'm not sure Japan would mind a really strong Korean Peninsula between it and China.
Yeah, exactly, because there's tension between Japan and China.
And
I think, but also then the X factor, perhaps even more than North Korea in all this, is America under Trump. And it's like, well, what stakes do we have in this conflict? Because American troops have basically been stationed in South Korea continuously since the 1950s. And South Korea and America still, well, we'll see if it happens anymore under Trump, but have for decades practiced war games or war exercises, basically just like kind of like, you know,
dropping bombs.
Yeah, basically just being like kind of flexing their muscle at North Korea and China, but also kind of quote unquote officially like always being prepared in case war breaks out in the peninsula. But the question is now, particularly after the end of the Cold War, it's like, what business does America have in that part of the world anymore? Or what business does it have in the Korean Peninsula?
I think
that's me personally. Because we have no stake in the game.
I think Trump's answer is business. So one of the things that North Korea has already started doing since the agreement is they've dismantled the nuclear facilities in Wonsan and they've turned it into a resort beach. They've built the condos that Trump was talking about. And you think about a really successfully run North Korean beach is going to attract millions of middle-class Chinese who can't quite afford to go to South Korea or Japan, who want to go to vacation and who might not want to go to Vietnam or something.
Yeah, and I think Kim Jong-un also, he has an incentive to try and reduce tension because I think he also realizes that if things keep ratcheting up, it will end in war, but also self-interest, it'll end in his death. And so I think for him, perhaps the best solution would be if he can reduce tension and kind of increase economic ties with China and South Korea, who knows what could happen. Maybe he could retire peacefully and just get like lots of money from people and he'll just be like, this is great.
Or you know? A lot of dictators do. Go live in New York.
Or like Switzerland or whatever, you know, and he can just retire.
He likes Switzerland.
Yeah, because he's educated there. He can just retire on a bag of money and he doesn't have to worry about it.
So the question again becomes, what is the price for peace? So are people willing to part with the, you know, sort of historical crimes of North Korea in order to ensure a better future for North Korean people? Or do people want a sort of like Gaddafi, Hussein, like post-Gaddafi chaos?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know I have talked about kind of I do have some qualms about the talks between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Not that, I mean, I support any kind of reduction of tension. I do think that American sort of military exercises with South Korea are kind of silly and provocatory at this point. Largely because I think North Korea knows that if it did try to start a war, it would get flattened instantly. I mean, it has a big, like I said, it's a problem where it has a big enough military power and arsenal that it can blow up the peninsula, but it has no immediate threat to the United States. And if it ever attacked American troops, I mean, we would just destroy.
Fire and fury.
Yeah, we would just we would wipe it off the map. And so it's just a problem because we would have no like quote unquote like I guess like nice public propaganda face of saying, oh, we're doing this for like developing the country. It'd be like, we're just gonna destroy it, it's the enemy, right? And so I think, but at the same time, so I support kind of the idea of peace talk. I support the ratcheting of tensions, but I think also there's like, the way you put it is people overlooking past crimes, because there is like that moral voice within me that says like, man, is this really going to end up where we're just going to let Kim Jong-un and the North Korean leadership walk after decades of horrific oppression and famine and, executions and gulags and just like the whole 9 yards of torture, rape, murder, assassination? You want to hold somebody accountable for that. And so I think there is kind of this sense of like moral sensibility where you want to hold the North Korean leadership accountable and punish them, but can you do that without starting a war that would kill likely millions of people? And also, I guess I also have qualms, is Trump really the guy that can pull off international peace talks? Like, I think these peace talks happen because he's crazy enough to do it, because Trump is so egotistical. Right. He's just like, I will succeed at anything I do. And so you kind of maybe have to have that mindset to be like, let's start talks with North Korea. But like, again, is North Korea ever going to feel like it has a good enough guarantee that America's not going to do regime change or not kill the leadership if they ratchet down their nuclear program? Because like, I know you're saying like there is some proof that they're ratcheting down their nuclear program, but like we don't know for sure if they're not hiding some away in some like mountainside.
So we also don't know what was actually said. So
yeah, and we also don't. There's no international atomic atomic energy commission people on the ground doing inspections.
But I think those are exactly the things that might make this work. So the fact that like, who knows what Trump promised Kim? He might have promised him a hotel empire.
Yeah, and who knows? And the thing is, like,
that might just work.
But also I just maybe worry, can Trump hold up his end of the bargain? And also Trump is his ego is so huge but so fragile. I mean, if Kim Jong-un does or says something, one wrong thing, could that blow the whole thing up? Like, I feel like it's like a tightrope situation. Like any little mistake could have really grievous consequences at this point.
I agree with that, but at the same time...
But at the same time, it's better than just letting the situation sit, because it won't get any better if you don't take any steps anyways at some point.
Yes, so as long as security can be guaranteed for North Korea, and as long as the United States... It's clear the United States is not going to pursue the human rights angle. They just left the UN Security Council.
We just dropped... we just left the UN Human Rights Council.
Human Rights Council. Which the United States left the same council from, I think it was 2003 to 2009.
Well, I think that the Human Rights Council does have some serious issues.
It's like led by Saudi Arabia first.
Well, and also like one of the leadership guys was like buddies with Gaddafi for a long time.
Oh, of course. They used to give the Gaddafi Peace Prize.
Yeah, which is like that's maybe even worse than Henry Kissinger winning the Nobel Peace Prize, right? It's just like, come on.
Every year they would give the Gaddafi Peace Prize to like Cuba and
I know. So that is less of an issue than it might sound.
But what I'm saying is the United States is willing to.
Well, at least so it's less of an issue of the U.S. leaving the Human Rights, because like the Human Rights Council itself is like totally corrupt. The United States is gonna put aside this issue and say, look, we're willing to work with you. Now it's up to North Korea not to piss off Trump. Or what about China, right? Because what happens if what happens if Trump and North Korea try to make some sort of backdoor deal that cuts China out of something?
Well,
that wouldn't go over too well either.
I don't think China really cares about North Korea.
You think they just want it done?
I think China's looking at the rest of the... Like, North Korea is insignificant to China's plans.
China's looking at Central Asia.
The string and pearl, man.
They're looking at Africa right now.
Yeah.
They're looking at Indian real estate.
Xi Jinping is like...
California real estate.
And it's been weird because, like, North Korea will, like, kind of openly mock Xi Jinping now. Like they don't care about China, and China's like they have the historic ties, but, like, other than that, I don't think Xi Jinping would lose his future over North Korea.
Yeah.
So, like, and I think that's going to be the reason that there's sort of stability between the U.S. and China there. And then South Korea, like, it doesn't have as much agency as I think they wish they did. So,
well, because they're an economic superpower for the region, but they're also like a tiny country.
And for them, too.
Like, they could easily get steamrolled by China in a military conflict. Like, absolutely.
Well, they absolutely benefit from trading with China, and that's what they're after. So they don't really, like, their number one worry probably is figuring out how they can make a peaceful transition of any sort of regime.
So things are up in the air. Work in progress. We will see what happens. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised literally by anything. I mean,
right.
Who knows? I mean, there could be like almost like a palace coup type situation in North Korea.
Yeah.
Like, who knows if there's like some hardline general that thinks Kim Jong-un is like stepping outside of boundaries. Who knows if Kim Jong-un's going to do a purge? Who knows if these... I mean, a lot of unknowns. Fingers crossed, hoping that the best case scenario actually does happen and you have kind of an official ending and de-escalation of tensions. American involvement in the peninsula is sort of taken away to a degree, and nuclear weapons are dismantled and the nuclear program is ended in North Korea, and sort of trade is able to happen, and who knows, that might be the best case scenario.
And I think hopefully this historical overview gives you more of a background, and hopefully you avoid making overgeneralized comments.
Yeah.
Like
I still would say though, keep an eye on it. Like it could go south very quickly. It could also go north very quickly. I don't know. I mean, everyone thought in the 80s, right, that under Gorbachev that, World War III could break out, and then the Soviet Union broke up under everyone's nose. And so perhaps something similar could happen. We will see.
Maybe it's something like Nixon Mao and the change of China's directions.
Yeah.
So,
even though I would, the worst timeline if it ends up being Donald Trump doing that. Man. I know I should engage in that character, but it is also just like kind of like anybody who can do it, good for them, but it's also just really frustrating.
Well, but I hope that's a trap that people don't fall into.
I feel like a lot of people are. I know I fall into it.
It's been really unfortunate. A lot of academics who've written really good things about North Korea are refusing to sort of say this is a good thing because they don't want to endorse Trump. But the only academic who's standing up for this... Well, there's a couple.
Is it Bruce Cummings?
Bruce Cummings.
Well, yeah. So we didn't even talk about Bruce Cummings. Bruce Cummings is a fairly infamous scholar on Korea and the Korean War. He wrote this 2-volume work called The Origins of the Korean War, and they have like these like epic subtitles, like The Roaring of the Cataract. Just these like amazing like poetic subtitles. And that book is sort of like kind of like the Mount Everest of studies on the Korean War and Korea. He's like a huge deal in that field of stuff. One of the few real American scholars who like knows Korean. But at the same time, Bruce Cummings is also kind of notorious because he has been accused of being apologetic for the North Koreans, and he thinks the CIA is like out to kill him, and he's kind of a conspiracy theorist. But we'll see what happens. We'll see. I would love to hear what Bruce Cummings is thinking right now.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on Hour of History. Hopefully you leave with a little bit better understanding of North Korea.
Yeah, have a good one, and let's hope peace in our time. Let's hope.
All right.